It should have been a firing squad. Instead, one of them offered her a piece of apple pie. 14 men stood in a loose semicircle, dust swirling around their boots. They wore hats stained by sweat, shirts rolled to the elbows, and holsters that rested easy at their hips. Cowboys, actual ones. Ranchers, rodeo hands, and Texas farm boys now dressed in army khaki. And in the center, a woman. Thin, shoeless, her Japanese uniform torn and muddy, her eyes scanning the circle like a trapped animal. She expected to be mocked, beaten, shot, maybe. Instead, one of the men took off his hat, crouched down, and placed a tin plate in the dirt in front of her. A slice of warm apple pie, steam still rising. The gesture was so strange, so profoundly wrong, her knees gave out. She knelt before her captors, unharmed, and wept. None of the men moved. They didn't know her name. But something unspoken passed between them, something that would change all of them forever. She had promised herself long ago that this moment would never happen. Back in the training camp in northern Kyushu, long before the jungle, the exhaustion, or the taste of American pie, she had stood shoulder to shoulder with other girls in pressed khaki uniforms, listening to the officer's voice thunder across the compound. "Better to die than be captured," he had said, and they believed him. Not because they truly understood death, but because the shame of capture was painted as worse. For weeks they chanted Bushido phrases before dawn. Suffering is honor, survival is disgrace. Even the smallest comforts were stripped from them. Hot tea was replaced with water, sleep was rationed, their identity was dissolved into service. They were told their bodies were not their own, tools to serve the emperor's will. To be captured was to return broken, dishonored, and erased. The enemy, they were told, had no mercy. American soldiers were beasts in uniform, killers, rapists, desecrators. Their propaganda was vivid and relentless. Films showed women torn from caves, stripped, mocked, left to die in shame. They watched, barely breathing, as instructors warned them this was their future if they failed, and so they made a pact in silence. If captured, they would not let themselves live. Her name was Akiko, though by the time she reached the final days of the war, even that felt foreign. She had not heard it spoken in months. Her commanding officer had called her nurse and little else. Her orders had been brief. The Americans were advancing faster than anyone expected. The supply lines were gone. The unit would retreat north, through the jungle. Those unable to walk were to be left behind. Those who fell behind were not to be waited for. Akiko watched as soldiers burned documents and maps, setting fire to what was once their field hospital. The smoke mixed with humidity, choking the lungs. She clutched a small cloth bag of gauze, morphine, and iodine, the only things she could carry. They were not supplies anymore. They were burdens. Her final order was shouted across the clearing as mortar fire echoed in the distance. "Do not be captured. Do not shame your uniform." For 3 days she marched with the rest, feet blistered, water gone. On the 4th day, her leg began to swell from a cut received while fleeing the burning post. By the 5th, she couldn't walk. The others didn't stop. She didn't blame them. That was the rule. When dusk fell and the jungle turned black, she found herself alone, half-conscious beneath a canopy of vines and branches, the earth damp beneath her. She tried to crawl, then gave up. Her head pounded. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the dull ache of collapse. She tried to remember her mother's face, but it blurred with the leaves above her. Death, she thought, was coming like sleep, silent and without ceremony. That was where the scouts found her. She didn't hear them at first. It was the sound of boots, foreign, measured, that stirred her. Then came voices, not Japanese, louder, coarser, and laced with something unfamiliar. Concern. The jungle rustled. She flinched, ready for pain. Instead, a shadow knelt beside her, and a canteen touched her lips. She recoiled. The hand withdrew. Then came something she never expected. Gentleness. Another voice, softer, asked something she didn't understand. She saw tan uniforms, pale faces. They weren't shouting. They weren't laughing. One of them pointed to her leg, then his own, miming pain. He didn't reach for her. He waited. And then, as if in a dream, she was lifted, not dragged, not thrown, but carried, across arms that held her like something worth keeping alive. She didn't know it then, but the war she had been trained to fight had already ended. The war she now faced, the one inside her, was only just beginning. The men who found her didn't look like heroes, at least not in the way she had been told. They were dirty, sunburnt, their uniforms sweat-stained and half unbuttoned. They carried rifles, yes, but not with menace. They moved like men used to saddle sores and long rides, not marches and medals. Cowboys, that's what they were, real ones. Boys who had grown up branding cattle, repairing fences under a blazing Texas sun, and drinking bitter coffee before dawn. Their names were Roy, Elmer, Hank, Boone, J.D., names that sounded like worn leather. Most of them had never been more than 100 miles from home until the draft scooped them up and flung them halfway across the world. They weren't officers or strategists. They were stock handlers, farm hands, rodeo riders. Some had lost brothers in the Philippines. Others had never even seen the ocean until boarding a ship bound for the Pacific. They weren't trained to handle prisoners, especially not a lone woman with bruised arms and a hollow look in her eyes. When they saw her slumped at the base of a banyan tree, they didn't know what to say. None of them spoke Japanese. She looked up when they approached, and the expression on her face was pure terror. Her lips cracked, blood dried at her temple, a stain creeping down the side of her torn sleeve. One of them, Roy, the one who'd grown up roping calves near Abilene, stepped forward slowly, his rifle hanging low. He raised one hand, palm open, like he was approaching a spooked horse. She flinched. Boone muttered, "She looks like she's about to die." He wasn't wrong. J.D., the youngest among them, barely 20, removed his helmet and scratched at his scalp. "What the hell are we supposed to do? We can't just leave her." No one said it aloud, but they all knew the stories. Some of them had seen it firsthand. Japanese soldiers and even civilians choosing death rather than surrender. Grenades clutched to the chest. Children trained to run toward enemy lines with explosives strapped to their backs. Suicide had become a strategy. And here was this woman, barely more than a girl, silent, shaking, waiting for what she thought must be her end. One of the men tossed a glance toward Elmer, who had once run a general store and never raised his voice in his life. He set down his rifle, pulled a canteen from his belt, and crouched. "She ain't got no weapon," he said quietly. "Ain't no threat." He gently rolled the canteen toward her across the mossy ground. She didn't move. Her eyes tracked it, wide with suspicion. "Just water," Elmer said, knowing she wouldn't understand. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." Roy reached into his pack and pulled out a ration tin. It was heavy with something he'd been saving, apple pie, packed in syrup and sealed like gold. He placed it in the dirt a few feet from her. "Here," he said. Then he backed away. The rest followed suit. They didn't close in. They didn't shout. 14 cowboys, standing in a loose circle, giving her space, as if they all knew instinctively that pressure would kill her faster than a bullet. She stared at the food, then at them. Her hands trembled. For a moment, no one moved. And then, as quietly as she had been trained to die, she reached forward and touched the canteen. She drank. Not much, just enough to stay alive. Roy saw it first, the change in her eyes, not trust, not even relief, just a flicker of confusion, a question. Why aren't they hurting me? None of the cowboys answered. They didn't need to. Their rifles stayed slung, their mouths stayed shut, and the war, for one brief moment, paused in the humid breath of the jungle. Not because they saw an enemy, but because they saw a human being. She didn't eat the pie right away. She couldn't. Hunger clawed at her insides like a feral thing, but the fear was stronger. She had been taught that kindness was a weapon in disguise, that the enemy would feed you only to laugh as you died. Poison, trickery, humiliation disguised as mercy. The tin of pie sat there in front of her, dented from the journey, its lid partially peeled back by one of the men. The sugary scent drifted toward her, something foreign, sweet and sickening. Her body begged for it, but her mind screamed that this was the first step into disgrace. Bushido was not just about war, it was about self-erasure. The body could ache, but the soul had to remain loyal. She stared at the pie until the jungle light began to fade, and still she did not move. The men didn't press her. They had retreated into their temporary camp, set up a perimeter, smoked cigarettes in silence, but someone, she didn't know who, came back while the others slept. Quiet as the wind, and left something beside the pie. A second tin, crackers, a piece of dried meat, half a chocolate bar melted slightly in the heat. It was placed carefully, not tossed. There was no note, no grand gesture, just food. More food than she had seen in a week. She didn't cry, not then, but she curled her body around the tins as if to shield them from the world, and she waited until the sun began to rise. That morning she opened the pie. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge of the tin. The crust inside was soft, golden, soaked with syrup. She sniffed it first, lips parted slightly. Then she took a bite. Just one. The flavor exploded in her mouth. Warm apples, cinnamon, butter, and something else she couldn't name. Her breath caught. Her body, thin and battered, seemed to jolt awake. She chewed slowly, her eyes wide, as if trying to memorize the taste in case it was the last thing she ever ate. It wasn't just food. It was a fracture, a break in the armor she had wrapped around herself since the war began. Her mind reeled. How could something so comforting come from the hands of an enemy? She ate the crackers next, then the meat. She saved the chocolate. But when she licked her fingers clean, something cracked inside her. Not bones, not skin, something deeper. The shame came like a wave. She dropped the tin and fell forward, hands pressed to the earth. Her shoulders shook with sobs that had no sound. There was no one to impress, no comrades watching, no commanders ready to strike her down for weakness. But still she cried as if the world might split open. It wasn't just hunger, it was betrayal of her training, of her oaths, of everything she thought she knew. And yet, deep down, she couldn't stop the truth, that the warmth in her belly made her feel alive again. That apple pie had undone what 1,000 drills could not. From the edge of the clearing, someone saw her. Roy, maybe, or Elmer. He didn't say a word, didn't approach, just tipped his hat and turned away, letting her have the moment in peace. Because this wasn't victory. It wasn't surrender. It was something far more dangerous. The beginning of doubt. They didn't take her to a prison. Not exactly. The place where she was brought didn't have cells or cages, just canvas tents strung between palm trees, with crates for chairs and hammocks slung low between trunks. It was a forward operating base, hastily set up near the coast, and it smelled of salt, engine oil, and black coffee. When she arrived, barefoot, swaying from fatigue, they didn't shout or bind her wrists. A medic gestured toward a cot and poured water into a tin cup. Another brought gauze and a small bottle of disinfectant. She tried to brace herself for pain. Instead, he asked, very slowly, with pantomime gestures, if he could clean her leg. She nodded. He worked carefully, his touch clinical, but not cold. When he wrapped the wound, she blinked back tears, not from pain, from the staggering strangeness of not being punished. For the first time in months, she slept without fear of someone kicking her awake. The next morning began without gunfire or orders, just the low murmur of men making breakfast and the distant whine of a generator. A tray was left for her beside the cot. Eggs, beans, something sweet and red. Jam, she would later learn. She stared at it, half expecting it to be taken away. It wasn't. When she ate, no one watched, and when she finished, someone handed her a folded bundle. A uniform. Not an American one, but something simpler. Soft gray cotton, clearly made for prisoners of war. But it was clean. It smelled of soap. She clutched it against her chest, unsure what to do. One of the soldiers, Boone, she thought, though she still hadn't learned any of their names, gestured to a wash basin behind one of the tents. She walked there slowly, clutching the bundle like a lifeline. The basin was metal, the water lukewarm, and beside it sat a small cake of soap and a towel folded with care. She hadn't bathed in weeks. Stripping out of her ragged uniform was harder than she expected. It felt like peeling away the last thread of identity. She scrubbed her arms, her legs, her hair, wincing at the dirt and blood that melted into the water. The soap smelled faintly of lavender. She didn't know the word for it then, but she would remember the scent for the rest of her life. When she dressed in the new uniform, it felt strange, not foreign, free. It hung loose on her thin frame, but it was hers, not assigned, not ordered, not beaten into her, just given. A small mirror had been nailed to the post beside the wash basin. It was cracked in one corner, the glass clouded. She looked into it cautiously. The woman who stared back was not the one who had entered the jungle. Her cheekbones were sharper, lips dry, eyes darker than she remembered. But there was something else, a kind of stillness, an absence of command. For the first time, she didn't look like a soldier or a prisoner. She looked like a survivor. She touched the edge of the mirror. Slowly, she turned her head, studying the bruises, the scar forming. On her lip, the smudge of dirt in her hairline. She had seen so many faces in mirrors during training, faces proud, hardened, ready to die. Now, here, she wasn't ready to die anymore. And that frightened her more than anything. She stared for a long time, unsure what she was mourning, the girl she had been, or the mask she had been told to wear. The mirror refused to offer answers. It only showed her the one thing her training had never prepared her for, herself. At night, lying in a bunk that was too soft and too clean, she would stare at the wooden beams above her head and try to remember what she had been taught. She pictured the instructor's face, severe, sunburnt, eyes sharp like flint, as he barked warnings about capture. "The Americans will not kill you," he had said, "but they will make you wish they had." The words had been carved into her like scripture. Surrender was dishonor, and yet here she was, alive, unshamed, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of starch and tobacco. No beatings, no laughter at her expense, just meals handed to her with nods, not sneers, hot coffee poured into her cup without hesitation. She kept waiting for the cruelty. It didn't come. Every kindness was a contradiction, every unspoken gesture chipped at the armor that had taken years to build. When a medic offered her aspirin for a headache, she recoiled at first, certain it was a trick. But the pain ebbed, and nothing else happened. When one of the cowboys tipped his hat to her after morning roll, she stiffened, expecting mockery. But he just smiled, squinting against the sun, and walked on. It was these moments, not loud, not dramatic, that did the real damage. They made her question everything. The barracks were shared with other female prisoners, some Japanese, some Korean, a few local civilians rounded up in the chaos of retreat. They spoke in hushed voices after lights out, afraid of guards who never came to eavesdrop. One of the older women, a radio operator from the southern front, whispered, "I saw a guard give a little girl a doll today, said it was from his sister." Her voice trembled. "What kind of monster does that?" Another said she had seen a soldier pick up a wounded dog and carry it to the medic's tent. "They treat animals with more care than our officers treated us." There was silence after that. Thick, uncertain. Akiko didn't speak much. She listened. Each word planted seeds of doubt she couldn't uproot. The stories they had been fed, of brutal, bloodthirsty Americans, didn't fit this strange new world. Even the food betrayed those lies. She had expected slop. She got stew, potatoes, even fruit once. She remembered one night a young corporal had handed her a second portion and winked. Not flirtation, just kindness. It unnerved her. One afternoon they were each handed a pencil and a piece of paper. A guard said slowly, "Write, family, letter." He gestured with broad strokes, miming the act of mailing. Akiko stared at the blank page like it might explode. She hadn't written anything in months. Her hand trembled as she held the pencil. She stared at the empty space where words should go. "Dear Mother," she finally wrote, "I am alive. They have not hurt me. I am warm." Then she paused. What could she possibly say next? That she had been offered pie by a cowboy? That an American soldier had wrapped her wound with the same care a mother gives a child? That her enemy treated her with more dignity than her own commanding officer ever had? She stared at the words for a long time. Then she added, "I do not understand this war anymore." She folded the letter slowly, handed it back to the guard, and watched him tuck it into a pouch with the others. She knew it might never reach home. It might be censored, burned, ignored. But she had written it, and that, somehow, was its own rebellion. Because the myths were unraveling, one act of compassion at a time. The cowboys came back on the third morning after she wrote the letter. She heard their boots before she saw them, heavy, deliberate, softened by the jungle earth. They weren't there on any official duty. They came in carrying sacks of supplies, a spare radio battery, and a crate of canned peaches. One of them, the tall one with the sun-creased face and the bandana around his neck, Roy, she remembered now, tipped his hat the moment he saw her. "Mornin'," he said with a wide, easy grin, the syllables unfamiliar but musical. She didn't reply, just nodded, eyes down, but inside something stirred. They didn't treat the camp like a battlefield. They treated it like a porch. Elmer sat on a stump, pulled a harmonica from his shirt pocket, and played something slow and wistful. Boone set up an empty tin can and invited anyone nearby to a game of horseshoes, drawing a few wary glances and shy laughs from the prisoners. J.D., the youngest, came up to her and pointed at the iron U-shaped horseshoe in his hand, then at the can, miming a throw. She hesitated. He waited. Finally, she nodded. The horseshoe was heavier than it looked. Her first toss landed in the dirt. J.D. gave her an exaggerated clap anyway, then tossed his and missed on purpose. She saw through it, and, to her own astonishment, she laughed. It was a strange sound, not sharp like the laughter of her old barracks, where tension made every joke feel like survival. This was softer, unforced. For a moment, she forgot about shame. The cowboys returned every few days, always bringing something small, a deck of cards, extra socks, a radio they let the guards play on low volume. They never asked for anything in return. Sometimes they just talked. They would sit in the shade and speak slowly, letting her hear the rhythm of their English. One day Roy pointed at himself and said, "Cowboy," then at her. She shook her head. "Nurse." It was the first English word she had ever said aloud. Later she learned howdy, not from a dictionary, from the way J.D. stretched it out with a grin like it was a welcome and a joke rolled into one. She practiced it under her breath, alone, before daring to say it back. "Howdy," she said one afternoon. Roy tipped his hat. "You sound just like us now." She didn't. She knew that. But the words, they felt less like a foreign language and more like a thread pulled between two distant lives. Still, the contradictions gnawed at her. These men were kind, but they wore the same uniform as the soldiers who had burned her village's fields. They handed her coffee with one hand, while their comrades dropped bombs from the sky. The war hadn't stopped. But somehow, here, it had slowed. She didn't know what to do with that. One evening, she tried to teach Roy a Japanese phrase, arigato. He mangled it. "Arigato." She laughed again. Then, softer, "Arigato." "Thank you." He said it back, slowly, carefully. Then, "You're welcome." She didn't know if they understood each other. Not entirely. But language was no longer the wall it had once been. It was a ladder now, one they were both climbing, rung by uncertain rung. These men weren't saints. They were soldiers. But in their own rough, dusty way, they were waging a different kind of war. A quiet campaign fought not with bullets, but with biscuits, bad harmonica tunes, and patience. And somehow that was the war that was winning. She first heard the music one dusky evening, just as the sun began to melt behind the canopy. It came not like a parade, but like a whisper, thin, warbling notes from a transistor radio someone had left near the mess tent. The voices were foreign, the rhythm strange, but something about it made her pause. Steel guitars laced through melodies, and rough voices sang with a kind of longing she couldn't translate but somehow understood. It wasn't the music of triumph. It wasn't marching drums or patriotic anthems. It was soft, aching, full of dust and distance. And it sounded, impossibly, like home. She sat nearby and closed her eyes, letting the unfamiliar lyrics wash over her. The words made no sense, but the feeling did. She could hear the loneliness, the ache for places that no longer existed, the love for people who might never come back. They weren't so different, these cowboys and her. All of them had left home. All of them were trying to survive a war in which the ground shifted every day. The music returned each night, always faint, always low. Sometimes a soldier would hum along. Once someone sang softly, off-key but with heart. She didn't know the tune, but she found herself humming too, quietly, afraid to be noticed. But one night she wasn't quiet enough. Roy was leaning against a post nearby, chewing on a toothpick, his boots crossed at the ankle. He turned when he heard her. His face lit up, not with surprise, but recognition. "You know it?" he asked gently. She didn't, but she smiled. That was answer enough. The next morning he was gone. No announcement, no farewell. His name wasn't called and no goodbyes were said. Just a missing face at breakfast. She scanned the camp, unsure whether to feel worry or betrayal. She wasn't his friend, not really, but his absence carved a hollow space she hadn't expected. Later, when she returned to her bunk, she found it, a napkin folded twice, placed gently beneath the edge of her cup. Inside was a tiny drawing, pencil on paper, a pie, steam rising in soft curls. Underneath, one word, "Howdy," scrawled in crooked block letters. She stared at it for a long time. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. She didn't cry, but something in her chest curled tighter, like a ribbon being pulled from both ends. Not grief, exactly, just the quiet heartbreak of impermanence. It struck her then. She had started to feel safe, not entirely, not foolishly, but enough to expect kindness, enough to be surprised by its absence. That in itself was terrifying, because if kindness could leave without warning, what else could? She clutched the napkin in her hand that night as the radio played again. The same song returned, slow, plaintive, sung by a man whose voice cracked on the high notes. She hummed along again, louder this time. No one shushed her, no one laughed. A few others joined in, their voices low and tentative. The prisoners, the guards, even a few of the cowboys, still posted nearby. None of them understood all the words, but they didn't need to. The song became a kind of shelter, a language not taught by books or drills, a language of broken things stitched back together. Every day in the camp reminded her of what had been lost, but every night, with music, shared bread, or a silent nod, reminded her of what could still be found. And the next time someone new walked past her bunk, she didn't look away. She smiled first. The war ended with silence, not ceremony. No cheers, no music, just orders, the kind that came sealed in envelopes, delivered by unsmiling men with clipboards and dates. Repatriation, they called it. Return. But return to what? She didn't know what home was anymore. Still, she packed the few things she had, the extra socks, the worn blanket, and the napkin with the pie drawing, carefully folded between the pages of her journal. Then she boarded the transport ship alongside others who looked just as unsure. Tokyo was no longer the city she remembered. Buildings had crumbled like paper. Markets were quiet. Faces were thinner, older, and people stared at her, not with joy, not with welcome, but with a quiet, cold suspicion. She was a former soldier who had not died in battle, a woman who had surrendered and returned. That made her a ghost. Worse, it made her a shame. Her mother didn't speak when she arrived, just opened the door, stepped aside, and went back to the kitchen. Her brother avoided her eyes. Her father had died while she was in captivity, and no one told her how. She was not asked what happened. No one wanted to know, because if she told the truth, it would only complicate the lies everyone needed to believe. Still, she tried, at first in hushed conversations. "They gave me medicine," she whispered once to a neighbor. "Real medicine, and pie." The woman blinked, then turned away. Another time she said, "They didn't hit us, they shared their food." Her friend frowned and said nothing. That silence grew louder every time she opened her mouth, so she stopped trying to speak. Instead, she wrote long, looping entries in a notebook she bought from a vendor who didn't ask her name. She wrote of the camp, of the horseshoe toss, of the music that hummed through the nights, of the cowboy who drew her a pie and vanished without goodbye. She described the moment she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the enemy or the girl she used to be. She wrote about the words she had learned, howdy, thank you, home, and the way they wrapped around her like something solid. She never showed the journal to anyone. Years passed. The war became history. Monuments were built. School books were edited. Soldiers were mourned, celebrated, or quietly erased. But no one knew what to do with someone like her, a woman who had not fought to the death, a woman who had been changed not by violence, but by kindness. Still, she wrote, she never forgot the taste of the pie, or the sound of a harmonica in the middle of a jungle, or the way the stars looked the night she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Sometimes she wondered if any of the cowboys remembered her, if they ever thought of the woman they had found in the dirt, too tired to run, too proud to cry. She hoped so, because they had given her something no flag ever could, proof that war might end, but humanity didn't have to. And if you've made it this far, don't forget to like the video and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The old man's handwriting was crooked, like a fence line left too long in the wind, but his memory was sharp. In the pages of his memoir, self-published, printed in a limited run for family, he told stories from the Pacific. Not of battles, not of glory, but of odd, quiet moments that stuck to the soul. One chapter stood out. It was titled simply, "The Girl and the Pie." He didn't name her. Maybe he didn't know it. Maybe he forgot. Or maybe he wanted to protect her. But the details were unmistakable. A jungle clearing, a makeshift camp, a Japanese nurse too weak to run, too proud to cry. He wrote of how she had stared at the slice of apple pie like it was a weapon, how she had held the fork as if it might burn her fingers, how she had taken one bite, just one, and begun to cry so quietly it took them all a moment to realize what was happening. She wasn't crying for the war, he wrote. She was crying because something sweet had survived it. The memoir made its way through a few circles of old men, reunions, VFW halls, American Legion meetings where the photos on the walls were fading faster than the men who hung them. Others remembered, not all the details, but the feeling. One recalled giving her his canteen first. Another remembered sitting nearby, trying not to stare. One swore he'd seen her write something in a small notebook late at night, using the light of the moon. None of them spoke of it as a grand gesture. No one called it heroism. It wasn't mercy, one wrote in the margin of his own copy. It was instinct. You see someone starving, you feed them. Doesn't matter what color their uniform is. Decades had passed, but that sliver of memory hadn't dulled. The jungle was gone. The war had been processed, analyzed, taught, and retaught. But that moment, of a girl and a pie, of enemy and soldier watching each other like reflections in water, remained untouchable. They remembered her not for what she did, but for what she made them feel. That somewhere in the heart of a brutal, senseless conflict there had been a pause, a breath, a moment of decency that no bullet could erase. And it was always the pie. That simple, warm triangle of crust and filling became more than dessert. It became memory, mercy, proof that something soft could still exist in a world built on shrapnel. The cowboy who wrote the memoir never said whether he baked pie again, but his granddaughter, in an interview years later, said he always insisted on having apple pie every 4th of July. He never told us why, she said, but one year when I was 12, I asked. He just said, because it reminded me of who I was before I learned to hate strangers. Sometimes memory doesn't come in flashbacks. Sometimes it comes in smells, cinnamon and flour and butter melting in the oven. Sometimes it's the quiet tear that slips down your cheek at the taste of something familiar in an unfamiliar place. She may have vanished, from their lives, but not from their story. And even though her name was lost, the feeling she left behind, the shared silence, the humbled pride, the bite of sweetness in the middle of war, remained. And in that she was never forgotten. She never made speeches, never sought recognition. After the war, she returned to the rhythm of life as if she were stepping onto a train she had almost missed. She married a teacher, raised 2 children, took up gardening, made tea the slow way, always steeped, never rushed. Her neighbors knew her as kind, maybe a little distant, polite, but private. No one pressed her. And she never offered. The war, they assumed, had damaged something inside her. But they were wrong. It had transformed something far deeper, something no one could quite see. She didn't wear her past like a badge, but she carried it, tucked away in the spaces between words. In the way she thanked the shopkeeper with a bow and a whisper of howdy under her breath. In the way she cut apples with careful hands and placed them in pastries her family adored. Her son once asked why she always made pie instead of the traditional sweets. She smiled and said, "Because someone once gave me one when I had nothing else." That was all she ever said. Years passed. The world changed. The war became a chapter in textbooks. New generations asked different questions. She stayed quiet, watching her grandchildren grow, watching the country rebuild. But through it all, she remained tethered to a memory that no one around her understood. Not fully, because it hadn't been about surrender, or shame, or even survival. It had been about dignity, the kind no regime could erase, the kind that arrived wearing dusty boots and offering a warm slice of pie in the heart of a jungle. In the shadow of hatred, dignity does not roar, it does not posture, it endures. Quietly. It teaches through example, through grace, through restraint. The men who could have shamed her did not, and so she chose never to live in shame. When she passed away, her daughter and son went through her things. Most of it was simple: sweaters neatly folded, old letters wrapped in ribbon, a pressed flower inside a book of poems. But in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, they found something else. A napkin, yellowed with age but still intact, folded carefully. Inside, a sketch, a slice of pie, and, beside it, a horseshoe, drawn with a rough hand, shaded just enough to show someone had taken their time. She had kept it all those years. No medals, no photographs, just a napkin. And that was her monument, not to war, but to what came after, to the truth that even the fiercest ideologies can be cracked open by gentleness. That transformation doesn't always thunder, it often whispers. In the end, her rebellion wasn't in defiance. It was in softness, in remembering, in passing down pie recipes with no explanation, in humming songs no one else in the family knew, in building a life not around vengeance, but around peace. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions are quiet. Sometimes 14 cowboys can break a belief system without breaking a single bone. And if this story moved you, leave a comment and share where in the world you're watching from. These are the forgotten archives of war and of healing.